I know that we often talk about kitchen table issues, and all of us have a number, and nobody in Washington wants to talk about what's really going on. If you own a home in Illinois, your insurance went up about 50% in 3 years. State Farm, our neighbors down in Bloomington, asked for 27% in one shot. Allstate and Northbrook came back for more, and Illinois logged 161 tornadoes this year, which is a record pace in August. And here's one thing that connects all of this. On January 27th, this country formally walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement. 3 weeks before that, we walked out of the treaty underneath it, the one every nation on earth had signed since 1992. We also quit the IPCC and about 60 other international bodies on the way out the door. So we're not even at the table, but the bill will keep showing up. Our next guest has been in those negotiating rooms since 2012. He sat on the board of the Green Climate Fund. He argues the United States owes the world money, not just apologies. Brandon Wu is Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA. Brandon, I hope I'm close on some of that, trying to pull together a bunch of research. How are you doing
That's
today?
exactly right.
Oh, thank you. How are you doing today? And are you staying hydrated, my friend?
I am doing well. I'm staying hydrated. It's hot where I am here in Washington, D.C., but not too bad. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. I was asking you before we started a little bit about where you grew up. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you moved to D.C. and what drew you to this work.
I'm originally from North Carolina. My parents are immigrated from China. And I've always had an interest in global justice work. That's looked like global economic justice, trade justice, environmental, and now climate justice. And interestingly, thinking about growing up in North Carolina, it used to snow there regularly every winter when I was a kid. We would have lots of snow days.
Wow.
I have a distinct memory of that. It doesn't do that anymore. Snow is kind of a rarity, and climate change is about much more than just weather, of course, and we can get into that.
Yeah.
But we are really seeing the impacts of climate change, even in our relatively short lifetimes. So.
I know that there's a lot of conversation around, well, look, I don't know, I can't put my finger on when I remember this sort of, backlash doesn't even seem like strong enough. This denial of science, of minimizing and actually villainizing people who talked about climate change. That's what has happened. Where would you put that? Because Nixon started the EPA. This was something where when we talk about freedom, you would think that being able to, people who pride themselves on the great outdoors and taking their guns out to go hunting would want to have clean water and, have access to the forests and the places. Now they've got data centers going in. Do you have like a bead on when this is it the corporations wanting to deregulate, kind of the beating heart of behind this?
Yeah, I think corporate power, especially the power of the fossil fuel industry, but not only the fossil fuel industry, also big agriculture, big tech now with data centers, right? All of these corporate interests are against more regulation on climate and environmental issues, right? But there's also a culture war thing. I don't think we can deny the culture war, and I think racism is a big part of that. One of the things we can talk about is how climate change is being linked to increasing migration, right? And we know that there's a sort of reactionary nationalism that's been happening in our country for at least a decade now, right? In response to immigration. And so there is this kind of vicious cycle where climate inaction leads to more climate impacts, which can lead to things like migration, which then feeds into right-wing narratives, and that feeds into more climate denial and inaction. And so it's this vicious cycle that we really have to break out of.
And before we had the dramatic wave of whether the climate change and having these conversations. I mean, it's also decades, as we mentioned, big ag and corporations destabilizing economies in other parts of the world and gobbling up the land that might have been used for people to be able to survive in order to have massive profits. So it is all part of that vicious cycle. Wow.
Absolutely.
I haven't had enough coffee to absorb to dwell on it too much. So let's start with the Paris agreement, right? With the Trump pulling
Hmm.
out of Paris and filing it under things that people. It's kind of it feels with everything else happening right now, Brandon. It's not even making a peep, right? With all
Hmm.
the the chaotic actions of this administration, the violence from ICE agents.
Right.
You've been in the rooms since 2012, is that right? With negotiating these
Hmm.
treaties and agreements. What is significantly different this time? Would you say? Because we didn't just leave the agreement, we left the treaty and the IPCC. What does that mean to everybody on the ground?
So, I mean, honestly, there's kind of good and bad things about this. And I should say I've been in the rooms in these negotiations, not as a government negotiator. I've never worked for the US government or any other government, but as a sort of civil society observer and an advocate. Um, and the US pulling out of all of these international treaties has meant, one, that there's not financial support coming from the US anymore. We were actually one of the biggest contributors to keep some of these crucial UN agencies running. You mentioned the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's like the scientific body that collates all the scientific research about climate change around the world. The U.S. was one of the biggest funders of that, and that was really essential. Now that's gone. Um, Another kind of more obvious thing is that we're no longer at the negotiating tables. And in some ways, that's actually a good thing
Okay.
because even under Democratic administrations, the US was never the good guy at the international negotiations. We were always sort of looking out for ourselves, which really meant looking out for our elites and our corporations, right? And so the role that the US has historically played in the international climate negotiations is actually one of watering things down. So originally we had the Kyoto Protocol, which folks may remember from the 90s. That was a treaty that required rich countries like the U.S. to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change. The U.S. did a lot of work to water that down, and this was under the Clinton administration, and make it weaker. And then we never even joined the treaty. So we made it a weaker treaty, and then we refused to join it because, and this is a quote, the American way of life is not up for negotiation,
Oh
right?
dear.
Meaning we're gonna pollute all we want, right? Um, and then the Paris Agreement, which you mentioned, this was agreed in 2015. This is the international agreement that again almost every country in the world has signed up to cooperate on reducing emissions. The U.S. made sure and this was a years long fight. The US made sure that that was not a binding treaty, that that did not actually require anything of any countries, that actually it's just a voluntary framework, right? Um, and the US, government negotiators will say, well, look, China never would have agreed to anything that was binding. And so the only way to get everyone to the table was to make it voluntary. But that's because the US has never agreed to anything that would bind us. The U.S. and other rich countries, we've had obligations, we've had commitments to reduce emissions. We haven't done it. We've had obligations to provide money to poorer countries to help them make the transition. We haven't done it, and so we have broken trust every step of the way. And the result of that was that the U.S. got its way in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, saying yes, we can have an agreement. Um, we need an agreement. We agree that we all need to cooperate, but it's all going to be voluntary. Um, and so, the point is the United States has not been a progressive force in the climate negotiations. And the fact that we're not there is actually opening up some interesting opportunities now for other countries to do some slightly more progressive things. Now, we're not seeing that happen as much as we want to. The countries that could ideally step in and fill the gap are the European countries, but mostly right now they're worried about security. And a lot of that, of course, is because of the shenanigans this administration is pulling, right? Starting a war in Iran for no reason. And so the European countries are like, we can't actually spend money right now on foreign assistance or climate finance. We got to spend it on our military budgets. And some of that's on them, some of that's on the Trump administration, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking about Greenland, right? Because there are companies that are sending in drilling teams without permission from Greenland. So why wouldn't you make
Right,
sure that your military,
right.
that your security is up to the
Yep.
challenge?
So it's this huge toxic spiral, right? I think you mentioned earlier that one of the things I work on is trying to get the U.S. to pay up to other countries. So the rationale behind that is we need the whole world to get greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible. But most countries in the world can't afford to do that, right? There are still countries where, you know, hundreds of thousands of people don't have access to energy, and the cheapest energy they have are fossil fuels. They need support from richer countries to transition to more expensive technologies that are renewable and clean, right? And those are countries that had very little to do with causing the climate crisis. And so we can talk about it as a climate debt that we owe to the rest of the world. We can talk about it as climate reparations. The sort of accepted term in the UN is climate finance. Um, any way you talk about it, we owe money to the rest of the world to solve the climate crisis. And the excuse we've always heard is that, oh, we don't have that money. Like that's not there's the money that you're talking about is not available. Well, okay. Last year, the Trump administration suddenly gave $200 billion to ICE and CBP,
Hmm.
right? $200 billion out of nowhere. That money did not exist before. The budgets before were 30 billion, which is still outrageous, but they inflated it from 30 to 200 billion to like lock up and deport innocent people. They're requesting $1.5 trillion for the military budget
Yeah.
this year. That's up 50%, right? So it's really helpful actually to see how much of a lie it is when politicians tell us, "Oh, we don't have the money for that." It just means that they don't care enough.
And who's
They're not
making the
prioritizing
profits,
it.
right? Who's making the
Exactly.
profits off
That's
of
right.
the privately owned detention centers? Because we know that
Exactly.
across the country we've got. I mean, I do stand up comic as well. I'm a stand up comic as well, and I learned like during in 2011 or so, our Democratic governor of Illinois, signed a contract with the private corrections facility owners that we would keep
Mhm.
the occupancy at 90%. How do you promise that you are going to have
Right.
90% occupancy other than you're going to find ways to incarcerate people at a profit?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so and it's
And that's that is so clearly the goal, right? Is just profit for Geo Group or Core Civic or whatever it was, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, it is so I mean and when the word reparations for folks, I mean it's part of the challenge is I guess comprehension of what a word
Mm,
means and where we're coming from,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
challenging too. Like
Mm-hmm.
what kind of
Yeah.
language do you find is helpful in having conversations who are resistant to understanding what's fundamentally happening?
I wouldn't necessarily start with the word reparations. Um,
Right.
I think reparations is a really useful framework because reparations is about more than money. And we can talk about that. But but with people who are initially resistant, I think the argument is that look, this isn't just an ethical or a moral issue where it's like there are countries and there are communities around the world who had nothing to do with causing the climate crisis, and they're the ones who are feeling the impacts the worst right now. Um, that's a moral argument that we should be supporting them as the richest country in the world that has benefited from the largest amount of greenhouse gases spewed into the atmosphere. That's a moral and ethical argument that works for some people. But there's also just a really practical argument that we will not solve the climate crisis unless the whole world is on board. And that cannot happen unless the rich countries start sharing the wealth a bit.
Are there
Uh,
are there
and
any
so,
are there any that are doing that right now? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Are there any that are
so
committed to it?
yes, but not to the scale that we need,
Okay.
right? So there are international laws, there are international obligations that require rich countries to pay climate finance. Again, that's the term in the UN. Um, Rich countries made a commitment to mobilize $100 billion every year in climate finance. Back in 2009, they made that commitment. That has not happened. What has happened is a bunch of like tricky accounting stuff where they're like counting loans and they're counting all this sort of nonsense that isn't really that isn't really a redistribution of money to poor countries, to the global south. Um, but no, like it, the scale of money is in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars per year, that needs to move in order to enable poorer countries to stop polluting. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to solve runaway climate change. And so there's just this very pragmatic argument that I think people are receptive to once they hear it, but they don't necessarily understand it intuitively. Um, but as long as somebody believes that climate change is real and understands that it is affecting their lives already or is going to in the very near future, then that very pragmatic argument is what I would go with. But I personally think the moral and ethical argument is also really, really important. But
Yeah. You have
that
to
doesn't
make
work for everyone.
you have to make your gains where you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking to Brandon Wu, Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA. Do you have time for another segment? I need to take a break. Would you mind hanging on for a moment and continuing the conversation? I appreciate it. We're going to continue.
Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to come right back in just a moment. Thank you for joining us for this conversation again with Brandon Wu, Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA. And do you have a website for while we're doing the break? Or is there social media platforms you'd like to share with folks?
ActionAidUSA.org. And then our handle on various social media platforms like Instagram, LinkedIn, etc., is usually just ActionAid USA.
Great, folks. During our commercial break, while you listen to the folks who help keep our lights on, check out ActionAid USA. More in a moment on WCPT 820, KKNW 1150, KTNF AM 950. Hello to all of our friends tuning in digitally. We'll be right back.
No detours, no distractions, just bold ideas and real talk. This is Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez.
Thank you so much for joining us. We continue our conversation with Brandon Wu. Really insightful and important. And I know so many of you are trying to find ways to hold on to the issues that are so important to you. And the climate is something I don't even want to get into what's happening with El Nino, because right now we're talking about what's going on globally as well. We're talking to Brandon Wu, the Director of Policy and Campaigns at ActionAid USA. Brandon, we talked a little bit about, I mentioned reparations, and I just know how much of a tripwire that can be for folks who are resistant to one, because I think reparations is an admission of doing something wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
That somebody and nobody and people have a cognitive inability sometimes to accept and process that. Talk to us a little bit more about what reparations is kind of the framework that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so reparations, I think, is most commonly understood as compensation, right? Damage has been done, and a way to make it right is by writing a check. That is a really important part of reparations. It's sort of the thing that people understand. It's the thing that's easiest to turn into policy, right? And so when we talk about climate reparations globally, a lot of what we're talking about is the check. Like we just talked about this earlier. It is about moving money to the global south so that those communities can build resilience, can recover, can transition to a cleaner economy. But reparations is more than that. I mean, you mentioned reparations is also just like the acknowledgement that harm has been done. That is actually really crucial for communities that have been harmed, just hearing an acknowledgement, right? And that it doesn't happen very often in terms of harms that have been done, say, by governments, right? It's pretty rare. The UN has a framework where there are 5 different pillars of reparations, and acknowledgement is one of them, because that can be really powerful and really healing. Compensation, of course, is another one. There's also rehabilitation, which is like, what kind of psychological and medical care do people need, legal and social services, because of the harm that's been done? And then, I don't have to go through all of them, but another of the really important pillars is non-repetition, right? And so the idea there is like, it's like in everyday life, right? It's not really an apology if you then go and just do the same thing again, right? That you're apologizing for. And so with reparations, non-repetition is crucial. It's not real reparations unless there's some kind of guarantee that the same harm is not going to be repeated. And so that's really interesting for climate reparations, because then you're getting into the fact that, okay, in order to achieve true justice, true reparations, then we got to tackle the fossil fuel industry, right? Then we got to tackle big agriculture. We got to tackle all the big polluters out there who are continuing to make this problem worse.
Yeah, and I again, no one wants to admit any of those things. So, has there ever been any sort in the area of doing harm to the environment, an admission of harm of doing that?
An admission of harm regarding environmental justice.
Mm.
This is a good question. I don't have an example off the
Wow.
top of my head.
Yeah,
You know, the
interesting.
examples I have are like the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa post-apartheid, right?
Okay.
There are also like examples of reparations that went the wrong way. So the classic one is like former slave owners being compensated
Oh,
for the loss of their quote
sure.
property, right?
Yeah.
After abolition. That was a real thing. The country of Haiti had to pay reparations to France and was doing it for like literally until not very long ago, right? Paid billions of dollars to France as reparations for the Haitian Revolution,
Yeah.
right? So,
I remember that.
there are examples of these things that go both ways. But in terms of economic, that's a very good question. I would imagine there are some small examples out there,
I
but it's a research project
I trip
for
over
me.
them once in a while. I I do. I no, because I this is like the way my brain works is like that's why I asked like who's doing it the right way. Are there countries that are leading the
Sure.
way and things like that? Because a modeling, or at least an example of saying, hey, here's something that works. Also, we touched on immigration and how much that has been one of the causing factors is the environment and global climate change, as well as we talked a little bit about the corporate disruption of economic systems over decades, and then being able to feed these caravans of migrants are coming across the board. It was all also staged in a way and manipulated when you have the governor of Texas then taking people
Yeah,
and
yeah,
just shuttling them all over the country, dropping them off in the middle of Chicago in the middle of winter with not proper clothing, to
yeah.
have the video of that, to feed the base, to throw red meat so that they to the bloodthirsty. Talk to us a little bit about what we were kind of touching on earlier.
Yeah, so I was saying about how immigration, by which we mean human beings, right? Just like regular people like you and me who are forced to move. Very few people do this because they want to, right? People who are forced to move for various reasons, and then their existence becoming demonized to feed a right-wing nationalist politics. Um, I think uh, this is obviously has been incredibly toxic for our country, um, especially in the past 10 years, but well before that as well. Um, but it's interesting to think about the links to climate change, right?
Yep.
The World Bank has estimated, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but hundreds of thousands of people are already being displaced every year because of climate and environmental impacts. Most of those people are not crossing borders, right? If you think about, oh, if I had to move, where would I go? Probably you're not just going to up and go to a different country. So most of those are internally displaced people, but the numbers are going to rise as impacts increase, and increasingly people are going to have to move across borders in order to find a better life for themselves. And the right wing is really weaponizing this. And there's a couple ways that we could go about this as a country and as a global society. We can really recognize the human rights of people who are moving and recognize that they have both a right to move and that their rights should be protected if they have to cross borders, but they also have a right to stay. And we should be doing, as a global society, we should do everything we can to enable them to stay, which means helping them build resilience in their communities to climate impacts. This comes back actually to climate finance, right? A lot of communities know what they need to do to build resilience to, I don't know, droughts, floods, storms. They just don't have the resources. And so moving money to help them build resilience reinforces their right to stay. So we could take that kind of a human rights based approach, a way that protects people, that respects what they're trying to do, that they're just trying to live a better life. Um, Or we can do what the right wants us to do, um, which is just say, yeah, we don't actually really care about those people. We don't care whether they live or die,
Hmm.
but we don't want them here.
Right.
And so our response to the climate crisis is going to be to militarize our borders, and create, there's an author, who called this the politics of the armed lifeboat. So we're
Mm.
going to create our little armed lifeboat, keeping everybody else out. And we're convinced we're going to be okay, right? Which may or may not be true. There are some elites that certainly will be okay, but definitely not everybody who lives here. Um, but there's this whole right-wing politics around militarizing our borders, keeping immigrants out, that sort of perversely ties into their own version of a response to the climate crisis.
I have been twirling around this idea of how the right, how conservatives operate from a place of hatred, and I
Hmm.
can't, I don't have I mean, its very base is otherizing somebody, dehumanizing, as you mentioned, basically acting as though human beings are disposable because they don't have the right papers.
Hmm.
Because they don't live here the way somebody wants them to, and I understand legally, and even then, that's not even being followed anyway. So I don't know why anybody cites any laws when due process isn't even being enforced, right? And whether it's
Yep.
a judicial warrant for permission to enter a homicide, a homicide. What I have that on the brain because of what's been happening,
Sure.
to your
Yeah.
home, to your car. So it's obviously selective, and I think, and this is so mushy, and I don't mean to loop you into this because it's just what's on my mind, is that the contrast to that is, to me, that we operate from love, and that can take on different ways. Loving the planet, loving our communities, our country, humankind, right? And we don't want to say that, and it's just, like I said, it's mushy. But my question here is that, what organizations do you, because the path forward to this, like, wanting to care for other people and caring for the planet, is feminine, essentially. And it's
Mm.
interesting to me that you put feminine
Hmm.
leadership at the forefront. And at a
Hmm.
time when this administration is trying to scrub that from every level of leadership, of participation, of in many ways existence publicly.
Yes. Oh, there's so much there.
Sorry.
No, no,
I,
no. It it is feminine, and like one of the things that we've been engaged in as ActionAid, we work again, work mostly on how U.S. policy affects the rest of the world, particularly people in the global South. And we've worked with a coalition that is talking about a feminist foreign policy, right? And that is fundamentally about a foreign policy, that is based on solidarity, not supremacy, right? And these are, yeah, so they are feminine values. I would want to say though that
I know.
they should be masculine
I,
values as well, right? And
hey,
that is also part of our work, is redefining
hey,
masculinity.
I know not all men,
Um,
believe me. I
well,
know.
okay, well,
I'm married to one, believe me. I know not all men, right?
um,
I didn't mean to throw you
um,
for a loop.
no, no, no. I'm trying to come back to what you were saying about, fear versus love, and you're saying love is mushy, and I think fundamentally the right is so effective because fear is just a really effective mobilizing force.
Yeah.
Um, but you can't build with it, right? And I think sometimes the left has tried. We've tried to build, from fear of a common enemy, or hate even, and it doesn't work. Like, you can mobilize people to demand change very effectively, but if you're actually trying to build a better world, it doesn't work. And you have to be grounded in love, and that's a lot harder.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder. It's not as immediately mobilizing for people, especially if they don't really believe that what you're saying is possible, right? um, and so I feel like what we're trying to do in the climate justice movement is so much bigger than just the climate, or even so much bigger than how climate justice interacts with racial justice and environmental justice and all these other things. It really is about, can we create a vision of a different world and a better world that people will actually buy into and believe in? Because that's the only way we'll get people to organize, themselves and their communities, around something positive. Um, and I do think that the extremity of some of the things we're seeing now with ice and CBP, et cetera, um, is somewhat helpful because people understand, okay, it's actually not enough to just say, um, we need to defund ICE.
Right.
It might not even be enough to say abolish ICE, right? Like, what are we actually fighting for?
Right.
Like, we need something that we're actually fighting for, and I think people are understanding that a bit more now, and it provides us something to build from. But that the act of building is hard, right?
Well,
And that's
with
our
that,
challenge.
what would you like to leave our audience with as far as what they can do, and some of the things maybe coming up that they should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a good segue because the resistance is crucial, right? I mean, we have to show that the stuff that's happening now is unacceptable, whether it's ICE kidnapping people off the streets, or the U.S. completely abdicating all responsibilities on the global stage, cutting all foreign assistance and climate finance and all of that. Like, we have to be vocal, not necessarily because the administration will listen, but because it will encourage other people to be vocal. Like, the worst thing that can happen is that everybody gets scared, everybody gets quiet, and that's how fascism takes root. So we have to do that. There's a second piece we have to do. We have to build the better world, right? And so we have to be in conversation with each other. And I'm talking about everyday people. I'm also talking about organizations like my own, about, like, what is the platform that we're going to fight for, say in 2 years, right? Say the election in 2028 happens the way it's supposed to. Not a guarantee,
Mm-hmm.
but it happens, and there is a window of opportunity we have that's maybe 6, 12 months long before Democrats get cold feet, right? We have to be ready for that opportunity, and it's our job as organizers, as people, just like people who care, um, to figure out what that platform is that we're going to push. So it's, there's the resistance, and then there's the vision, and we have to do both.
Outstanding work that you do, everybody at ActionAid USA. This has been a great conversation. I look forward to more. If you would join us again, it would be a pleasure to have you on, because I know there's a lot going on and a lot of moving
Would
parts.
love to.
And absolutely, and a really fantastic conversation. Again, we've been talking to Brandon Wu. You can find all their work at actionaidusa.org. That's actionaidusa.org, and find them on all the social media platforms. And again, we look forward to having you back. Stay hydrated, my friend.
You too. Thanks so much for having me.